Let me share my screen. Thank you
All right.
so very much for
Sorry.
that
All right.
great introduction. So yeah, so I'm sharing my screen right now. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So thank you so much for deeming it fit to invite me to give this presentation on such an important topic, which is already changing the landscape. So essentially, today I'll be talking about understanding the importance and role of genomic science in improving healthcare in Africa. Indeed, genomic science has a transformative impact on the health of humans and in fact on the One Health initiative. And it's actually a revolution, and it is better that we are part of this revolution to be able to benefit from it in terms of not only human health, but also our economy in Africa. So there has been several revolutions, as we know. The Industrial Revolution in 1800, in the second Industrial Revolution, which was in 1900, and the third Industrial Revolution. But now we have the fourth Industrial Revolution, driven by data, driven by genomics. And reference has been made to this by the earlier speaker, that a person's genome has 6.4 billion letters of information about how that person is going to live his life and the phenotype of that person. Of course, we know the phenotype in the end is going to be a product of the genome itself, the mitochondrial DNA, and of course, interaction with environment that will determine the physical trajectory of an individual. So really, the code book that tells about the health and the likelihood of developing diseases for a particular human being, for each human being, is already written as it is written. If we can use that terminology, it's written in their genes. Of course, there are a lot of things that can also modify this, which we need to study. So we need to be able to understand and decode this to help each individual to live a fulfilled life. And that is where genomics come into play. Now, when you look at this diagram, you will see that there are different types of diseases. And like we mentioned, some are, genetics determined, some are environmental, some are mixed, some are completely environmental. For instance, maybe infection, smoking, but some are completely monogenic or completely familial, like sickle cell disease, for instance. But in the middle, there is a huge number of diseases that are either oligogenic or polygenic. So what are we trying to do? We are trying to understand diseases that afflict human beings to be able to know which genetic determinants are written in these 64 billion base pairs, that determines whether a particular person is going to have one disease or the other. Many times for multifactorial conditions like hypertension, like dyslipidemia, it's actually omnigenic or polygenic, meaning there are so many, sometimes tens and dozens really, or scores of genes that determine whether someone is going to have a particular disease or not. And environmental activity can also modify or modulate the impact of those conditions. Now, these environmental activities include the socio-political, economic environment, the macroeconomic environment, cultural issues, which influences social position, education, occupation, income, all of these affects lifestyle, behaviors, and psychosocial factors, social factors, which influence biological factors and eventually affect the health. Now, this is a panoramic view of the role of genomics and the other omics, and that is microbiomics, metabolomics, proteomics, transcriptomics. DNA makes RNA makes protein, but then there are also metabolites and microbiomes. So we need to understand these for each individual. And based on our understanding of this for individuals, we can then go ahead to develop novel biomarkers, that is new ways of diagnosing diseases, and I'll give you some examples. Prediction and prognostication engines that tells us whether someone is going to develop a stroke or hypertension or diabetes or a cancer later in future and in how many years' time, you know, almost like stargazing, but scientific stargazing by reading the code that is written not on the palm this time around as in palmistry, but written in the genetic code that each of us is carrying and interpreting these accurately and appropriately. And that requires a lot of work, meaning that we must have a dictionary, a database, a reference point, you know, to be able to interpret the genes of individual based on data collected from multitudes of people. And then we then be able to understand patterns through artificial intelligence, through bioinformatics or statistical genetics, and be able to use these patterns to recognize and determine the proclivity of an individual to develop a condition or otherwise. So, and not only that, this also has led to identification of molecular targets for new medications, for new vaccines, for new precision solutions for a lot of conditions, whether they are infectious or not. And of course, rational polypharmacy. In fact, we look forward to a day where through genetics or genomics, we'll be able to tell when a patient comes that, look, you need this particular dose of these antihypertensive, and we don't need to wait to start titrating the dose before we get the right dose for that particular individual. Same thing with diabetes and same thing with other chronic conditions, including seizure disorder. So what are we saying? We are saying that precision health through genomics and transomics helps us to determine new ways of identifying susceptibility, screening for disorders even before they appear, preclinical progression, you know, screening for those, and then early diagnosis, prognostication, and in fact, new treatments across the life course for different disease entities. And this helps us, of course, in the end, to reduce costs and to reduce disease burden. So precision health and genomics have a role right from the womb up to even molecular autopsy. Planning a baby, you know, almost possible nowadays to even have designer babies, even though we need to look at the ethical and spiritual implications of those, which we are still going to discuss in this lecture. Then the fetus itself, the newborn, and then it helps when a disease is not yet manifest to be able to already determine that, you know, disease prevention, infectious diseases, cancers, molecular diagnostic pharmacogenomics, and even to be able to gauge the lifespan or health span of an individual. Of course, that is excluding other variables like accidents or injuries or trauma or war and all that. And of course, molecular autopsy at the end. So to collect this kind of data, then we need genetic data, we need data from the environment, we need phenotypic features from the family history, clinical notes, clinical labs, diagnostic imaging, drugs that patients are on. This helps with pharmacogenomics, survey instruments to collect information, and of course, variants from single genes that we may know. And in fact, we may expand this to metabolomics, epigenomics, gene panels, exomes, and in fact, whole genome sequencing to get all the information about the individual genetic code. Diets, microbiome, drug adherence, biomonitoring, wearables, exercise, pedigree analysis, you know, all of this. And in the end, this helps us to have a database through which new solutions for diseases, including deep phenotyping of diseases, historical and socioeconomic data collection and then utilization, meteorological data collection and utilization, And that helps us to have data which we can use to develop profiles and scores, not only for prognostication, but for diagnosis, for prevention, and for treatment of diseases. And so data is really very important. And so the data value chain is also very critical. And that means that we need to identify existing data tools and also data that is available on the African continent for various disease entities. Establish these data ecosystems, integrate them, and then perform quality control or quality assurance on this data. And then it's important to, before using any of these data, to put them through the framework of political, legal, ethical, anthropological, and socio-ecological considerations before one can actually use this data. And then have a data governance and cybersecurity policy and principle, and data sharing policies, and then make this data interoperable and of sufficient granularity, and eventually convert this data into data that is either protected or is ready for machine learning and AI for discovery of novel causal pathways, disease mechanisms, molecular targets for new treatment, for prevention, and for solutions. So this precision medicine or innovation products can include precision policy implementation that targets socioeconomic and political determinants of disease, validated biomarkers created from transomics work, including polygenic risk scores, which are beginning to gain more and more traction and role and importance, even though it looks like the polygenic risk scores that are developed for other populations in the Western and the Northern Hemisphere are not really very useful in Africans, as we found. So also are risk predictors that are developed from Birmingham study and from the other countries, are really not as useful among Africans, because Africans are indeed very unique and peculiar, and we have to determine the validated biomarkers, novel biomarkers, and risk prediction tools and engines, including polygenic risk scores for the African population. So it's also useful for One Health and environmental impact assessments, novel data collection methods and techniques, including biobanking products and nutrigenomics. And of course, emerging diseases surveillance, which has been mentioned. We all know the role that molecular biology and genomics and transomics played in conquering COVID-19, in monitoring and tracking the burden of COVID-19, and of course, in diagnosing it, detecting it, monitoring progression, prognostication, and eventually, of course, in vaccine development, and in fact, also novel therapies for COVID-19. So this applies to other emerging diseases, Ebola, Lassa fever, and of course, even the chronic conditions that we have with us, like hypertension, diabetes, dyslipidemia. We are beginning to understand them more and more and determine what the predictors are, that determine whether someone is going to develop any of these conditions, including heart attack, even schizophrenia, and other conditions. So research and disease understanding, using the tool of research to understand several diseases, and then clinical decision-making tools that already has information about the individual that a clinician is seeing at a particular point in time, and therefore using that information to be able to determine and what is going on in that patient, make an accurate diagnosis, and of course, prescribe the appropriate treatment for that patient. Also at the community level, I already mentioned new drug development and vaccine development. So what is happening in Africa? Even though we know that infectious diseases are still very important, but in 2019, there was a change. so to speak. Cardiovascular diseases, including stroke, became the leading cause of death on the African continent. And so we prescribed the NCD quadrangle as a way of addressing this. And that includes epidemiological surveillance. And you know, epidemiological surveillance is also aided by the tools of genomics. Health promotion and prevention based on determinants that are unraveled through genomics, improving acute care using interventions too, that are developed through the tools of genomics, and of course, rehabilitation. So Africa is partaking in the genomic revolution, and this was made possible by the Asia Africa Initiative, which is still ongoing. Several African countries are part of this. And we use that opportunity to launch the SIREN study, which is actually the largest study of stroke on the continent of Africa, and has different aspects to it: the phenomics score, the genomics score, the biostatistics and bioinformatics score. And over 6,000 cases of stroke and about 6,000 controls. Rigorous phenotyping algorithm, which is published, and very, very rich database, clinical database, spanning personal and lifestyle factors, socioeconomic factors, neurological assessments, the stroke subtype, neuroimaging, costs in the hospital for even up to 1 year, blood tests, genetic markers, novel tools for screening and establishing stroke-free status, and novel tools which also earn the patent for phenotyping stroke images, and a vast, reliable biorepository with more than 200,000 samples already and still counting, solar-powered, and then integrating all of these data sources together to unravel the determinants, genetic and environmental determinants of stroke on the continent of Africa. And so the first thing we did was to look at the environmental determinants, and we were able to identify 11 conditions that accounted for more than 90% of the burden of stroke. And part of that, of course, is family history of CVD, which is genetically driven. And some of these other conditions like diabetes, disability, and hypertension also have genetic undertones. And we were pleasantly surprised that consumption of green leafy vegetable on a daily basis overwhelmingly and clearly protected against stroke. In fact, much better with non-overlapping confidence interval compared to those who consume vegetable on a weekly basis. And this is something that is very, very common in our environment and is not too expensive and is generally available and can be used to prevent stroke. But we need to understand how this interacts with molecular processes and genomics and the pathways through which it's able to offer protection. And based on some of the things that we found already, we are developing the Afrocentric stroke risk prediction tool. And this is going to be integrated into the polygenic risk score for stroke once developed. And that will give us the ability to be able to predict the risk of developing stroke for individuals on an individual level. And this is going to be made freely available or as mobile phone app for every African to use. And this is one of the precision medicine tools that underscores and emphasizes the power of genomics and how genomics can be used to prevent stroke, which is the second leading cause of death globally and the leading cause of death in Africa, and so improve the health of Africans and human beings in general. So unraveling stroke includes understanding the genome, the exposome, the transcriptome, the epigenome, the metabolome, and so on. So we were the first to discover the association between apolipoprotein 1 and stroke, and we are performing the very first ever GWAS of stroke in Africa with very, very interesting discoveries, which is going to be published very, very soon. We are also part of the Geiger stroke, which is even bigger than this, with over 1 million subjects. We've been able to identify more than 64 loci for stroke across the globe, including among Africans. And this is undergoing review in Nature journal, and hopefully this will be accepted and published very soon. So decoding the genetic or genomic code is very important because it helps us to understand not only stroke, but also other conditions like hypertension, which have overlapping genetic determinants with it, dyslipidemia, lipid levels, coronary artery disease, atrial fibrillation, venous thromboembolism, white matter disease. So on the African continent, we also want to understand hypertension and other conditions that are risk factors for stroke. And so we started the SHARE consortium, which has more than 55,000 subjects. And we've been able to determine the relationship between hypertension and obesity. Obesity doubles the risk of hypertension on the African continent. So if we're able to tackle obesity, we might be able to also reduce the burden of hypertension on the continent of Africa. And there are other findings across the African continent. This is about obesity and hypertension, which will soon be published. So green leafy vegetable was something we found very interesting. Protects against all types of stroke. And in fact, now we found that it also protects against cardiovascular diseases. So diet is very important. Consumption of vegetable-dense diet protects against stroke and cardiovascular diseases, whereas red meaty diets, is a risk factor for stroke. And this is being disseminated. And we've developed a stroke prevention video, which is also freely available based on our findings. And this is part of primary prevention of stroke in Africa and worldwide. This is published in Lancet on how to prevent stroke across the globe. Part of how to do this is also to use genomic tools. And we can see how important it is to involve all segments and sectors of the society. Our work has been recognized with the award of outstanding contributions to clinical stroke research, which we got by the World Stroke Organization, and publications in Nature, next chapter of African genomics, on what we are trying to do to improve the contribution of genomics to improving health and well-being of Africans, and the organizations that will help us to ensure that this is achieved, including ecosystems that involves implementation partners, policymakers, and the general population in the genomic revolution. What are the challenges? The challenges include IT, computing infrastructure, biorepository, personnel, trained personnel, and therefore capacity building is very important, mentorship, high throughput, next-gen sequencing facilities, cybersecurity, data use policies, data governance strategies, political, legal, ethical framework, and local resources are also important. And I really want to commend GET for ensuring that this is going on and spearheading efforts to bring the tools of genomics to bear in fighting diseases and preventing diseases and predicting the emergence of diseases on the African continent. We also have the Center for Genomic and Precision Medicine in the College of Medicine, University of Ibadan, which is also trying to do this through research, mentorship, training, biorepository, bioinformatic capacity building to ensure that this is done. So, and recently we are using this also for mentorship for neurogenomics across the continent of Africa. So in a nutshell, it's a collaborative thing, multidisciplinary, and that's the only way we can bring the fruits of transomics to bear in clinical research and to reduce the burden of non-communicable diseases, infectious diseases, and improve the well-being of Africans. Thank you so very much, and congratulations, GET, for this great webinar.